After her mom died, her husband divorced her to marry her best friend, completely unaware that she had just inherited $80 million, abandoned by the two people she trusted most, left with nothing but a cramped studio apartment and a locked cedar chest she'd never seen before. But inside that chest is a secret her mother kept for 20 years, a handwritten ledger, dozens of names, millions of dollars, given away in silence to strangers across the city. Now she has 1 year to find every person her mother secretly saved. But her ex-husband is coming for the money he doesn't know exists. Why did her mother hide a fortune and live like she had nothing? What will happen when the truth comes out in open court? And what's the one name in that ledger that will change everything? Before we begin, drop where you're watching from in the comments, and stay close because this story will stay with you. The long tone woke her before anything else did. Denise Whitmore opened her eyes in the fold-out chair beside her mother's hospital bed at Methodist South, and for one cruel half-second, she didn't understand what the sound meant. Then she did. The green line on the monitor had gone flat and the room had changed. The air itself had changed because Ruth Carter was no longer breathing in it. Denise reached for her mother's hand. It was still warm. She held it with both of hers and pressed it against her cheek, and she sat like that without moving or speaking until the nurses came through the door. They were gentle. They moved around her like water around a stone, checking what they needed to check, noting the time, 1:47 a.m., and one of them, a young woman with box braids and kind eyes, touched Denise's shoulder and said, "Take all the time you need, sweetheart." Denise didn't take the time. She couldn't. She kissed her mother's forehead, smoothed the thin hospital blanket over her chest, and walked into the fluorescent hallway and sat down on a plastic chair bolted to the wall. 14 months. That's how long she'd been in and out of this building. 14 months of unpaid leave and drained savings, and sleeping upright in that fold-out chair while the pancreatic cancer ate through Ruth Carter one organ at a time. 14 months of feeding tubes and morphine adjustments and learning to read the numbers on machines she never wanted to understand. Her back ached. Her eyes burned. She was 38 years old, and she felt like she was 70. She thought about Ruth's life. The small, tidy bungalow on Prescott Street with the paid-off mortgage and the vegetable garden out back. The 2009 Camry. Ruth washed by hand every Saturday. The coupon clipping at the kitchen table on Sunday mornings, scissors in one hand, coffee in the other, reading glasses on a chain around her neck. Ruth Carter had lived like a woman who counted every dollar because she believed every dollar should be counted. She wore simple house dresses. She drove careful. She loved hard and she loved quiet. Denise's father, Harold, had died when Denise was 13. A heart attack at 48, sudden and merciless. Ruth never remarried. She never even dated. She kept Harold's photo on the nightstand and his shoes in the closet for 2 years before she finally gave them away, and even then she kept one pair of his Sunday loafers in a box on the top shelf, as if he might come back for them. Now Ruth was gone too. Denise pulled her phone from her pocket and called Harry. It rang 5 times. When he answered, his voice was thick with sleep and something else. Annoyance, maybe. Irritation at being woken. "Harry, Mama passed." A pause. A long one. Then, "Okay, I'll handle the arrangements. Try to get some sleep." The line went dead. Denise stared at the phone in her hand. She didn't cry. She was too tired to cry. 3 days later, they buried Ruth Carter on a gray Memphis morning at Memorial Park. The casket was simple oak. Ruth would have wanted simple. Tanya Price sat beside Denise in the front pew, holding her hand, smelling like expensive perfume, her highlighted hair pulled into a low chignon. Harry stood apart near the end of the row, checking his phone with the screen tilted away from the pews. At the graveside, Tanya leaned close to Denise's ear. "Your mama was the strongest woman I ever knew," she whispered. "You're just like her." Denise squeezed Tanya's hand and said nothing. Behind them, Harry glanced at his watch. That evening, Denise drove to Ruth's bungalow alone. The house smelled like lavender and old paper, and the faintest ghost of the lemon cleaner Ruth used on every surface. Denise moved through the room slowly, touching things. The kitchen counter, the back of Ruth's reading chair, the crocheted throw on the couch. She wasn't ready to sort anything, not yet. But she opened the bedroom closet to hang up Ruth's church coat, and behind the winter coats, pushed into the far corner, she found something she'd never seen before, a cedar chest, small, dark, and heavy, with a brass lock and no key. Denise pulled it out and set it on the bed. She tried the lock. It didn't give. She turned the chest over, looking for a latch or a hidden release, but there was nothing, just solid cedar and a lock that wasn't opening. She set it aside with the rest of her mother's things and told herself she'd figure it out later. There was too much else to carry right now. She had no idea how much she was about to lose or what that chest was about to give her. 10 days after the funeral, Harry sat Denise down at their kitchen table. Sympathy cards were still spread across the surface, some opened, some not. Beside a wilting arrangement of white lilies from Tanya, Harry had his hands folded in front of him like a man who'd rehearsed. "I want a divorce," he said. Denise looked at him. She waited for the rest of the sentence, the part where he said he was joking, or the part where he said they needed to talk about what that word really meant. But Harry just sat there, jaw set, watching her with the expression of a man who had already left and was now just delivering the paperwork. "I've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "You let yourself go, Denise. You've been emotionally absent for over a year. I deserve to be happy." She heard the words. She understood them individually. But together they made a kind of noise that didn't match anything she recognized, because she had spent the last 14 months sleeping in a hospital chair so her mother wouldn't die alone, and the man across the table was telling her she hadn't been present enough for him. "Is there someone else?" she asked. "No," Harry said. He said it too fast. Denise didn't push. She didn't have the energy to push. She nodded and stood up from the table, and that was the end of her marriage. Not with a fight, not with slamming doors, but with a woman too hollowed out to do anything but absorb one more blow. 2 weeks later, she found out about Tanya. It wasn't a phone call or a confession. It was a photo on social media. Tanya's hand extended toward the camera, a diamond ring catching the light, Harry's arm around her waist, and a caption that read, "When God closes a door, he opens a window." The engagement announcement came before the divorce was even finalized. Denise stared at the screen in the break room at work, her lunch going cold, and felt something shift behind her ribs. Not breaking exactly, something deeper. The realization that the woman who had held her hand at her mother's funeral, who had brought casseroles to the house during chemo weeks, who had whispered, "You're just like her at the graveside," that woman had been sleeping with her husband. Denise didn't fight the divorce. She couldn't afford to. Harry's lawyer was aggressive and expensive, and Denise had no savings left after 14 months of unpaid caregiving leave. Harry took the house. Harry took the car. Denise was left with $4,200 in checking and a stack of boxes she loaded into a borrowed car, while Harry stood in the doorway and watched. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, Denise," he said. "We both know this was over a long time ago." She didn't answer. She closed the trunk and drove away in a car that wasn't hers, to a life she hadn't chosen. The studio apartment on Lamar Avenue was 400 square feet of stained carpet and humming fluorescent light. The kitchen was a hot plate and a mini fridge. The walls were thin enough to hear the neighbor's television through the drywall. Denise carried her boxes in alone, stacking them against the wall. Clothes, a few books, her mother's things. The locked cedar chest sat on the floor beside the mattress. She lowered herself onto the edge of the bed and looked around the room. 6 weeks. That's all it had taken. 6 weeks ago, she'd had a mother, a husband, a best friend, a home, and a life that, even if it wasn't perfect, had felt like hers. Now Ruth was buried in Memorial Park. Harry was posting photos with Tanya in the house Denise had cleaned for 11 years, and Denise was sitting in a studio apartment with $4,200 and a chest she couldn't open. She pressed her palms against her eyes and breathed. Somewhere across Memphis, a certified letter was making its way through the postal system, and everything was about to change. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after Ruth's death. Denise pulled it from her mailbox on the way to work, a thick cream envelope with the return address of Whitfield and Associates, attorneys at law, Nashville, Tennessee. Inside was a single page requesting an urgent meeting regarding the estate of Ruth Carter, a phone number, a name, Leonard Whitfield. Denise called from her car in the parking lot of her patient's apartment complex. A receptionist with a polished voice put her through immediately, as if they'd been waiting. Leonard Whitfield spoke slowly, carefully, and said very little, only that Denise needed to come to Nashville in person and that she should clear her afternoon. She drove the 3 hours the next day. Leonard's office was on the 4th floor of a limestone building near Vanderbilt. Oak-paneled walls, leather chairs, the faint smell of old books. Leonard himself was tall and silver-haired in a charcoal suit that fit like it had been made for him. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and Italian leather shoes that were old and immaculate. He shook Denise's hand with both of his and gestured to the chair across from his desk. Then he told her. Her father, Harold Carter, had invested $50,000 in a logistics software startup called Trackline Systems in 1994, a colleague's company, a handshake and a check. Trackline was acquired 4 years later. The stake multiplied, and Ruth, quiet coupon-clipping, 2009 Camry Ruth, never touched the principal. She let it compound for over 2 decades. In 2003, she placed everything in an irrevocable trust managed by this firm with one beneficiary, Denise. Leonard folded his hands on the desk. "The current valuation of your mother's trust," he said, "is approximately $80 million. Denise didn't move. She heard the words, but they arrived like sounds from another room. Muffled, impossible, belonging to someone else's story. She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She closed it. Leonard let the silence hold. He was a man who understood that some truths need time to land. Then he slid a small brass key across the desk. "Your mother left this with our firm," he said, "with instructions that it be given to you only after the trust was revealed." The cedar chest. Denise's fingers closed around the key, and she felt the weight of it. Not the metal, but the meaning. Ruth had planned this, all of it. Leonard handed her a sealed envelope, cream-colored like the letter that brought her here, but this one was addressed in Ruth's handwriting, shaky, slanted, written in the final weeks. Denise broke the seal and read. Ruth's letter was not long. It asked one thing, that Denise spend 1 year continuing to support the people Ruth had been secretly helping across Memphis. The trust allowed immediate charitable distributions, but Denise was to live on her own salary for 12 months, not a dime on herself. Ruth wanted her daughter to walk in her shoes before claiming her new life. "Your mother built this estate over 2 decades of patience and discipline," Leonard said quietly, "and she entrusted every dollar of it to you because she believed your character was worthy of it." Denise drove back to Memphis with the brass key in her coat pocket and her mother's letter on the passenger seat. The highway blurred. She kept her hands steady on the wheel and her breathing even, because if she let herself feel everything at once, it would pull her under. Back in the studio apartment, she knelt on the stained carpet and fit the brass key into the cedar chest's lock. It turned with a soft click. She lifted the lid. Inside, a handwritten ledger, the pages dense with Ruth's careful script, stacks of cashier's check stubs held together with rubber bands, old receipts, handwritten notes with initials, addresses, dollar amounts, and dozens of them, page after page. 20 years of anonymous giving, recorded in a dead woman's hand with the precision of someone who believed every act of kindness deserved to be remembered, even if no one ever saw it. Denise touched the first page. Her fingers trembled. "Who were you, Mama?" she whispered. The ledger was open. The first name was waiting. The next morning, Denise called Leonard from the floor of her studio apartment, the cedar chest open beside her, the ledger in her lap. She needed to understand the rules. Leonard was patient and precise. The trust allowed immediate charitable distributions. Denise could continue every payment Ruth had been making, but for 12 months, her personal rent, her groceries, her bus fare, all of it had to come from her own home health aide salary, not $1 of the trust for herself. Denise hung up and looked down at the first entry in her mother's handwriting. Careful block letters in blue ink, E.T., 744 Dunavant Street. Rent, ongoing. She drove her borrowed car to Dunavant Street that afternoon. The duplex was small and white with a concrete ramp leading to the front door. The flower bed along the walkway was weeded clean. A folded American flag hung in the window. She knocked and waited. The door opened, and Earl Tucker looked up at her from his wheelchair. He was 67, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped gray hair and calloused hands that gripped his wheelchair rims, like a man who still expected the world to demand something of him. His home was immaculate. Photographs of his army unit on the wall, a Bible on the side table, the faint smell of pine sol and coffee. Denise introduced herself carefully. She said she was Ruth Carter's daughter, that her mother had passed, that she was trying to understand the things Ruth had done. Earl's face changed. Not shock, exactly. Something softer. Something that had been waiting. "Miss R.," he said quietly. He told Denise everything. Ruth had been paying his rent for 12 years. She came every quarter with groceries and conversation, never rushed, never distracted, never once making him feel like a project. She brought him pound cake at Christmas and asked about his garden in the spring. She called him Mr. Tucker every single time. "Miss R. never once made me feel like a case number," Earl said. His eyes brimmed. His voice didn't break, but it bent. "She made me feel like somebody's people." Denise thanked him. She promised the rent would continue. She sat in his living room for an hour, listening to him talk about Ruth the way people talk about the person who kept them alive, with a kind of reverence that doesn't have a word. That evening, she called the next number from Ruth's phone contacts, a man named James Birch, listed with a church address. Pastor Birch answered on the second ring, and his voice was warm and unsurprised, as if he'd been expecting this call for weeks. Ruth, he told her, had brought him sealed envelopes every quarter for over a decade. Each one contained cashier's checks earmarked for specific families in the congregation and beyond. Every envelope came with the same handwritten note, for their dignity, not their debt. Birch never asked where the money came from. He trusted Ruth's heart more than he needed to understand her means. Together, over the phone, they cross-referenced the ledger. Entry after entry matched a family Birch knew: a widow on Trigg Avenue, a janitor at Whitehaven Elementary, a grandmother raising 4 grandchildren on Social Security. Ruth hadn't been performing random acts of kindness. She had built a system. A quiet, invisible network of support stretched across South Memphis, maintained for 20 years by a woman in a house dress who drove a Camry and clipped coupons. Denise sat in her car outside Earl's duplex. After hanging up, she pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and cried, not from sadness, from something bigger than sadness, the staggering, almost unbearable realization that her mother had lived an entire secret life, had carried an entire hidden world of generosity, and had never once said a word about it, not to Denise, not to anyone. She wiped her eyes and looked down at the ledger in the passenger seat. She circled the next entry with her finger. YM, Medical Methodist. The trail was just beginning. The following week, Denise walked into the billing department at Methodist Hospital on her lunch break, still wearing her scrubs from a morning shift. She asked a clerk about an anonymous payment made 3 years prior, a patient's full oncology balance, cleared overnight. The clerk checked the records and confirmed it. $127,000, paid by cashier's check, no name attached. The patient's name matched the initials in the ledger, YM Yolanda Mitchell. It took Denise 2 more days to find her. Yolanda lived in a small brick house in South Memphis with her 2 children, worked double shifts at a FedEx sorting facility, and wore steel-toed boots and a reflective vest to work. She was 34, tall and slim, with close-cropped natural hair she'd kept short since chemo, and a small gold cross necklace she never took off. When Denise knocked on her door on a Saturday morning and said the words, "Ruth Carter," Yolanda's face went still. Then it broke. Yolanda pulled Denise inside and sat her down at a kitchen table covered in her children's homework. She talked fast, through tears, her hands gripping Denise's like she was afraid to let go. 3 years ago, she'd been in remission but drowning. The hospital bills had piled to $127,000, and she was 2 missed payments from losing the house. She had started looking at which of her kids' things she could sell first. And then one morning, a billing clerk called and told her the balance was 0. Just like that. No explanation. No name. "I prayed every single night," Yolanda said, her voice cracking, "for God to tell me who saved my life so I could thank them." She squeezed Denise's hands tighter, and he sent her daughter. Denise stayed for an hour. She told Yolanda as much as she could without revealing the trust, only that Ruth had helped people quietly, and that Denise was trying to understand the full scope of it. She promised Yolanda she'd stay in touch. She meant it. Meanwhile, across town, Tanya Price was redecorating. Denise saw the photos that night, scrolling on her phone in the dim light of her studio. Tanya posing in Denise's former living room with new throw pillows and a gallery wall, captioning the post, "New chapter, new energy." The house Denise had cleaned for 11 years, staged like a real estate listing by the woman who had held her hand at her mother's funeral. Mutual friends liked the photos. A few left heart emojis. No one asked where Denise was living now. Denise set the phone face down on the mattress. She walked to the kitchen table, a card table, really, pushed against the wall, and opened the ledger. She drew a neat line through Yolanda's entry and wrote beside it, "Found. She's okay." Above the table, the wall was becoming a map. Earl's address, Yolanda's name. The families Pastor Birch had identified, index cards and sticky notes and a web of connections pinned to drywall in a 400-square-foot apartment. Her mother's invisible empire was becoming visible, one face at a time. And Pastor Birch, who had been watching Denise more carefully than she realized, was ready to have a very different kind of conversation. 6 months into the year. Denise had now traced and personally visited 11 of Ruth's beneficiaries. She had sat in living rooms and hospital waiting rooms and church basements, listening to strangers describe a woman they knew only by her kindness. And each visit carved Ruth's secret life a little deeper into Denise's understanding of who her mother really was. Pastor Birch invited her to dinner on a Thursday evening. His home was a small brick ranch house behind Greater Hope Baptist, and the kitchen smelled like cornbread and collard greens and the warm sweetness of a peach cobbler cooling on the counter. He set 2 plates on a table covered with a vinyl cloth and said grace, with his eyes closed and his thick hands folded. Then he looked at Denise and spoke plainly. "I've been watching you for months," he said. "I watched you trace every name in that ledger without telling a soul. I watched you ride the bus in January while your ex-husband drove the car you paid for. And I figured out enough to know that Ruth left you something real, something more than memories." Denise stiffened. She hadn't told anyone, not a word. Birch held up his hand. "I'm not asking for numbers. I don't need numbers. What I need you to hear is this." He set his fork down and leaned forward. "Child, your mother spent her whole life making sure nobody saw her hand. But I see yours, and it's time you let somebody help you carry this." Denise's eyes stung. She pressed her lips together and nodded, and for the first time in 6 months she felt something shift in her chest. Not the weight lifting exactly, but the knowledge that she didn't have to hold it alone. That same week, Denise made another discovery, a ledger entry marked differently from the rest. The handwriting more deliberate, as if Ruth had paused before writing it. D.C. college tuition, every year, 2008 to 2012. Denise stared at the initials. D.C., her own, she called Leonard. He confirmed it. Ruth had secretly paid off Denise's student loans through a third-party payment service. Every semester, 4 years. Denise had always believed she'd qualified for a government forgiveness program. She'd even told friends how lucky she'd been. But it wasn't luck. It was Ruth. Her mother had erased that debt and never said a word, protecting Denise even from the burden of gratitude. Denise sat on the edge of her bed and held the ledger to her chest and breathed through the ache of it. Her mother had been taking care of her all along, invisibly, completely, even while Denise was taking care of Ruth. That evening, Leonard called again. His voice was measured but serious. Harry's divorce lawyer had been making inquiries about Ruth's estate, asking questions about assets, about transfers, about the trust. Leonard warned Denise that Harry might file a motion to contest. "The trust is airtight," Leonard said, "irrevocable, established 8 years before you married him. But he can still make noise, and noise has consequences." Denise hung up. She sat in the quiet of her apartment and felt the walls close in. Harry circling something he didn't understand, Tanya rewriting history on social media, and Denise sitting in the middle of it all with a secret worth $80 million and a promise she intended to keep. She drove home from Pastor Birch's words, still warm in her chest. She had an ally now, one person who saw her, but Harry was circling, and he had no idea what he was circling toward. 3 days after Pastor Birch's dinner, Leonard called again. This time his voice was not just serious, it was sharp. Harry had filed a motion to contest Ruth's trust. The divorce was already final. Harry had the house, the car, the furniture. Denise had her clothes, her mother's things, and $4,200 that was now closer to $3,000. Harry's lawyer had dismissed Ruth's estate as negligible during the settlement. A dead woman's bungalow and some personal effects. But someone had been talking. Someone had told Harry there might be more. Harry's attorney argued that gifts Ruth made to Denise during the marriage, specifically the student loan payoff and any other undisclosed transfers, constituted marital assets that should have been divided. The trust itself was irrevocable and predated the marriage by 8 years, so it couldn't be touched. But the motion forced a public probate hearing, scheduled 8 weeks out, and Leonard warned Denise of something worse. A temporary freeze on the trust's charitable distributions was possible while the court reviewed the filing. Earl's rent, Yolanda's support, the scholarship funds, all of it could stop. "The filing will fail," Leonard said. "I promise you that. But he can slow things down, and the people your mother was protecting will feel it." Denise hung up and sat in the silence of her apartment. Then her phone lit up. Tanya had posted. A long public screed, paragraphs of polished venom. She called Denise unstable, jealous, a woman who clung to her dying mother to avoid dealing with her failing marriage. She said Harry had tried to make it work for years. She said Denise had pushed everyone away. She said she was sorry it had come to this, but the truth needed to be told. Mutual friends shared it. People Denise had known for a decade, women she'd sat next to at birthday dinners and baby showers. They liked the post. They left comments. Not one of them called Denise to ask if any of it was true. Then Harry's text arrived. Denise read it in the dim light of her studio, sitting on the edge of the mattress with the phone 2 inches from her face. "Your mama left you nothing but junk in that storage unit. Sign over whatever's left and move on with your life." She read it twice. She set the phone face down on the bed. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of holding so much silence for so long. She was sitting on $80 million and a legacy that would have made every person in that comment section go quiet, and she couldn't say a word. She had promised Ruth. Denise stood. She walked to the wall above the kitchen table, the wall covered now in index cards and sticky notes and addresses and faces, and she stood there, breathing, looking at the names of every person her mother had saved. Then she picked up the ledger and opened it to the next page. She wasn't done yet. The following week, Denise walked into the financial aid office at Southwest Tennessee Community College with the ledger open to a string of entries she'd been puzzling over. Annual deposits, same amount each fall, routed through a third-party service to the college's scholarship fund. 8 years of payments. No name attached. Gloria Hines, the financial aid director, was a broad-shouldered woman in her mid-50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a jar of peppermints on her desk. She'd worked in that office for 22 years. She didn't rattle easily, but when Denise explained who she was and what she was looking for, Gloria went very still. She pulled the records. 14 scholarships over 8 years. $340,000. Every one anonymous, routed through the same third-party channel, with the same instruction: full tuition and books for a student who would otherwise drop out. Gloria had processed the donations year after year, respecting the donor's privacy because she understood that some people gave for results, not recognition. "I always wondered," Gloria said quietly, pulling a worn manila folder from the bottom drawer of her filing cabinet. "But I never asked." She set the folder on the desk and slid it toward Denise. Inside were handwritten thank you letters, 14 of them, one from each scholarship recipient, written to a benefactor they'd never met and could never name. Letters that had sat in Gloria's filing cabinet for years, undelivered, because there was no one to deliver them to. "Whoever your mother was," Gloria said, and her voice caught for the first time, "she changed lives in this building for almost a decade, and not one of those students ever got to say thank you." Denise asked if she could read them. Gloria nodded and left her alone in the office. Denise read every one. A young man who was the first in his family to attend college, who'd been 3 days from dropping out when the scholarship letter arrived. A single mother studying nursing, who wrote that the money didn't just pay for school. It told her someone believed she could finish. A woman who'd come back to school at 41 after her husband left and wrote simply, "I don't know who you are, but you saw me when I was invisible, and I will never forget it." Denise pressed the letters against her chest and wept, not quietly, the kind of crying that comes from a place so deep it doesn't care who hears. That evening, she pinned the letters to the wall of her studio apartment beside the ledger entries and the addresses and the faces. The map of Ruth's invisible empire now stretched from floor to ceiling. Earl, Yolanda, the families Pastor Birch distributed checks to, and now 14 students who had built lives on a stranger's faith in them. Denise sat on the floor and looked at the wall. The ledger was almost finished. Only one entry remained. 2 weeks before the probate hearing, Denise turned to the final page of Ruth's ledger. The handwriting here was different from the rest. Shakier, the letters uneven, written by a hand weakened by illness. Ruth must have added this entry near the end, during those last months when the cancer was taking everything but her will. TP, tuition, 2011 to 2015. Denise stared at the initials. Her stomach dropped. She called Leonard. He pulled the trust's distribution records and confirmed what Denise already knew in her gut. Ruth had anonymously paid $48,000 for Tanya Price's college tuition at the University of Memphis, 4 years of business school, the degree that launched Tanya's real estate career, that paid for the highlights and the acrylic nails and the confident walk into open houses across Shelby County. Ruth paid it because Tanya's family couldn't afford it, and because Tanya was Denise's best friend, and Ruth believed that helping the people her daughter loved was the same as helping her daughter. Tanya never knew. She never learned who her benefactor was. The woman now posting publicly about Denise's instability, the woman redecorating Denise's home and sleeping beside Denise's husband, the woman who had whispered at Ruth's graveside that Denise was just like her mother. That woman had been educated on Ruth Carter's money. Leonard waited on the line. The silence stretched. Finally, he asked what Denise wanted to do with the information. "Nothing," Denise said. Leonard paused. "Nothing? I'm not going to use it. Not in court. Not anywhere." Her voice was steady, quiet, the voice of a woman who had spent months walking in her mother's shoes and understood finally what Ruth had been teaching her all along, that generosity doesn't come with conditions and dignity isn't a weapon. Leonard was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You are more like your mother than you know." Denise closed the ledger. Every entry traced, every name found, every face seen. That afternoon, she drove to Memorial Park for the first time since the funeral. She sat on the grass beside Ruth's headstone. Plain granite, no flourishes because Ruth wouldn't have wanted flourishes. And she talked. She told Ruth about Earl and his spotless duplex and the way he said Miss R like it was a prayer. She told her about Yolanda's gold cross necklace and Gloria's filing cabinet full of letters that never reached the woman who deserved them. She told her about the 14 students. She told her about Tanya. "You gave her everything, Mama," Denise whispered, "and she still couldn't learn what you were trying to teach." The wind moved through the oaks. Memphis hummed in the distance. Denise sat until the light turned gold, then drove home. The eve of the hearing. She laid out a simple navy dress, set the ledger and Ruth's letter on the table beside the brass key, and for the first time in months, she slept soundly. Morning light. Denise woke, picked up the ledger, and drove toward the Shelby County Probate Court. What happened next would change everything. Shelby County Probate Court, 9 o'clock in the morning. Denise walked through the double doors in a modest navy dress and flat shoes, the ledger in a bag at her side. She didn't look at the gallery. She didn't look at the reporters in the back row. 3 of them, notepads open, tipped off by Harry's lawyer for what was supposed to be a sympathetic story about an abandoned husband fighting for his fair share. She sat down beside Leonard Whitfield and folded her hands on the table. Across the aisle, Harry sat in a charcoal suit with a fresh fade, his tag Hoyer catching the courtroom light. His attorney, a broad man in a pinstripe vest, was already shuffling papers with the confidence of a man who expected a short morning. Behind them, in the second row of the gallery, Tanya Price sat with her legs crossed and a small smile on her lips, as if she'd come to watch a show she already knew the ending to. Harry's attorney opened strong. He stood and addressed the judge, a no-nonsense woman in her late 50s with graying hair pinned back and frameless reading glasses, and painted Denise as evasive, the estate as suspicious. He referenced undisclosed gifts during the marriage and a modest estate of unknown value that Denise had hidden from divorce proceedings. He demanded full disclosure and a freeze on all distributions. His voice filled the room. He was performing. The judge turned to Leonard. "Counsel for the respondent." Leonard Whitfield rose. He buttoned his jacket with one hand, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, and stood at the podium with the unhurried stillness of a man who had been waiting for this moment for months. He began with Harold Carter, a mid-level manager at a Memphis shipping company, a quiet man who invested $50,000 in a colleague's logistics software startup called Trackline Systems in 1994. Leonard placed the original investment document on the projector, then the acquisition records, then the compound growth statements, year by year, decade by decade. He let each page breathe. He let the numbers speak. Then he said the figure. The current valuation of the Ruth Carter Irrevocable Trust is $80,400,000. The courtroom went silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that has weight. Harry's face drained of color. His hands, which had been resting on the table, went rigid. His attorney stopped writing. Behind them, Tanya's smile vanished. Not slowly, not gracefully, but all at once, like a mask knocked loose. Leonard continued. He presented the trust's legal structure. Irrevocable, established in 2003, 8 full years before Denise married Harry Whitmore. The student loan payoff Harry's lawyer cited came from the trust's charitable distribution account, not marital funds. Every angle of the claim collapsed, document by document in Leonard's calm, methodical hands. Ruth Carter built this estate over 2 decades of discipline and generosity, Leonard said, his voice steady, carrying to every corner of the room. And she entrusted it to the one person whose character she believed was worthy of continuing that legacy. The judge called a 15-minute recess. Harry and his attorney retreated to the hallway. Harry stared at the floor. His hands hung at his sides. He didn't speak. Tanya hadn't moved from her seat. She sat perfectly still, staring at the table where Leonard's documents were stacked in neat rows, and for the first time in this entire story, she had absolutely nothing to say. The hearing was about to resume, and Leonard was not finished. The courtroom reconvened. The gallery was fuller now. Word had spread through the building during the recess, the way it does in courthouses, and several clerks and attorneys from other chambers had slipped into the back rows. The reporters had put their phones away. They were listening. Harry's attorney stood. His voice was quieter than before. "Your Honor, my client moves to withdraw the contest motion." The judge accepted the withdrawal. Then she looked at Leonard over her reading glasses and said, "Mr. Whitfield, the court invites you to complete your presentation for the record." It was a pointed signal, and everyone in the room understood what it meant. The judge wanted the full truth entered into the official record, where it would live permanently. Leonard nodded. He opened the ledger. He presented Ruth Carter's charitable legacy: the handwritten entries, the cashier's check stubs, the scholarship records from Southwest Tennessee Community College, 20 years of systematic anonymous giving, families across South Memphis whose rent was paid, whose medical debts were cleared, whose children went to college because a woman in a house dress and reading glasses believed their dignity mattered more than her recognition. Leonard laid it out methodically, entry by entry, and the courtroom absorbed it in silence. Then, with Denise's permission, Leonard read from Ruth's letter. His voice was steady, but when he reached the key passage, he slowed. Ruth had written about why she trusted Denise with everything. Not because Denise was perfect, not because she was strong, but because, in 38 years, she never once asked what she would receive. She only ever asked what she could give. A woman in the gallery pressed her hand to her mouth. One of the reporters closed his notebook and just listened. Denise sat with her hands folded, eyes glistening, and did not look away. Pastor James Birch took the stand next. He spoke the way he always spoke, measured, warm, direct. He told the court about Ruth's sealed envelopes, delivered every quarter for over a decade. He told them about Denise appearing at his door months ago, carrying a ledger she barely understood, asking how she could continue her mother's work. He told them that in 40 years of ministry, he had never seen a young woman absorb so much pain with so much grace. He did not mention Tanya's tuition. Denise had chosen to protect that secret, and Pastor Birch honored the choice without being asked. The judge removed her glasses. She looked directly at Harry. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "you left a marriage during your wife's deepest grief and then contested an estate you knew nothing about. This court finds your claim entirely without merit." She paused. "Your conduct is beneath the dignity of these proceedings." Harry didn't move. He sat with his jaw clenched and his eyes fixed on the table. His attorney began packing his briefcase. Tanya was already gone. She had slipped out during Pastor Birch's testimony, and no one had noticed. The judge dismissed the case. The reporters in the back row were no longer writing the story Harry's lawyer had pitched them. They were writing a very different one. Denise walked out of the courthouse into the Memphis afternoon. Leonard walked beside her. The ledger was under her arm. She stopped at the top of the stone steps, tilted her face toward the sun, and breathed. For the first time in almost a year, the weight was lighter. Within 48 hours, the story spread. Local news ran it first, then regional outlets picked it up, and the headline wrote itself: "Husband divorces grieving caregiver during mother's cancer. Unaware she inherited $80 million. It was everywhere and shared, reposted, discussed at kitchen tables and in break rooms across Memphis and beyond. Harry's employer moved fast. Auto South Dealership Group called him into the GM's office on a Thursday morning. His sales numbers had been sliding for months. Distracted, entitled, coasting on charm that had stopped working. The public embarrassment was the final reason, but it wasn't the only one. Harry sat across from his general manager in a windowless office and heard the words he never expected to hear. His keycard was deactivated while he watched. Security walked him to the parking lot. He drove home in the car he'd taken from Denise in the divorce, her old car, the one she'd been making payments on while she slept in a hospital chair. And the irony of it settled over him like something cold and permanent. Tanya's fall was quieter, but just as complete. Her brokerage dropped her within the week. Clients canceled listings. Open houses went unattended. Her social media, the carefully curated feed of redecorated rooms and inspirational captions, went dark overnight. Not deleted, just silent. The engagement collapsed without a public announcement. If you'd walked into Harry's kitchen that week, you would have seen everything you needed to know. Tanya's ring on the counter beside car keys and a half-packed moving box. Interview requests poured into Denise's phone. Reporters, producers, podcasters, people who wanted her to sit in front of a camera and tell the world what it felt like to be vindicated. Denise didn't answer a single one. She didn't post. She didn't gloat. She didn't send Harry a message. She didn't even change her social media profile. She hadn't updated it in over a year, and she wasn't about to start now. She picked up the phone and called Leonard. "Now I want to talk about the foundation," she said. That same evening, 200 miles apart, Earl Tucker and Yolanda Mitchell watched the news story on their television screens. Earl called Yolanda. They'd become friends in the months since Denise connected them, two strangers bonded by the same invisible hand. Earl's voice broke on the phone. "She came to my door like she had nothing," he said, "and asked about my life like I was the most important man in Memphis." He paused, drew a breath. "Just like her mama did." Yolanda was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "That woman rode the bus to my house, Earl. She sat at my kitchen table in a coat with a hole in the sleeve. And the whole time, she could have been anywhere in the world." The next morning, Denise sat in Leonard's office with a legal pad and a pen. At the top of the page, in careful handwriting that looked more like Ruth's every day, she wrote 3 words: Ruth Carter Foundation. The private empire was about to go public. 3 months after the hearing, Denise stood in the living room of her mother's bungalow on Prescott Street. Except it wasn't just a bungalow anymore. The walls had been freshly painted. The floors had been refinished. Gloria Hines' desk sat where Ruth's reading chair used to be, and the hallway was lined with framed pages from Ruth's handwritten ledger, each one mounted behind glass like the sacred documents they were. A brass plaque beside the front door read, "The Ruth Carter Foundation." Denise had funded it with a $20 million endowment. 3 pillars: caregiver support services, medical debt relief, and the Ruth Carter Scholars Program at Southwest Tennessee Community College. She built her team from the people her mother's legacy had touched. Gloria, the woman who had processed Ruth's anonymous scholarships for 8 years, became the foundation's executive director. Yolanda Mitchell, the single mother whose hospital debt Ruth erased, now led the caregiver program, training counselors who understood what it meant to survive. Pastor Birch joined the advisory board, carrying the same mission he'd served for decades into a new structure, and Earl Tucker became the foundation's first legacy resident, permanent, rent-free housing in a home maintained by the foundation, honoring Ruth's longest-standing beneficiary. Denise also did one more thing. She filed the paperwork and reclaimed her maiden name. She was Denise Carter again. On the day of the ribbon cutting, they gathered on the porch, the same porch where Ruth used to sit and clip coupons on Sunday mornings. Earl was in the front row in his wheelchair, his shirt pressed crisp. Yolanda stood beside him with her 2 children. Gloria held the oversized scissors. Pastor Birch said a prayer. And behind them, crowding the sidewalk and spilling onto Prescott Street, stood every beneficiary Denise had traced from the ledger. Faces she had found, one by one. Strangers who had been connected all along by the quiet hand of a woman none of them fully knew. 1 year later, the numbers told the story Ruth never could. $2.3 million in medical debt cleared for 614 families, 200 caregiver families served, 12 new scholars funded. Earl tended a tomato garden at his legacy home, rows of Cherokee purples and better boys in raised beds he'd built himself. He showed Denise one afternoon, wheeling between the rows with dirt on his hands and something close to joy on his face. "Your mama gave me a roof," he said. "You gave me a reason to grow something under it." Yolanda trained her 3rd class of peer counselors. Pastor Birch's congregation launched a neighborhood giving circle inspired by Ruth. Families pooling small amounts to help other families, the way Ruth had done alone for 20 years. Harry Whitmore had moved to a smaller apartment in South Haven, Mississippi. He worked a lower-level sales job at a lot that sold used cars. There was no redemption arc, no phone call, no reconciliation, just the quiet, permanent consequence of a man who had measured everything by surface and lost everything that mattered. Tanya Price had vanished from Denise's world entirely. No posts, no contact, no presence. She was simply gone, which was the worst fate for a woman who had needed, more than anything, to be seen. A letter arrived at the foundation one Tuesday morning. A young woman in North Memphis, one of Ruth's original scholarship recipients, now a nursing school graduate, wrote to say she wanted to volunteer. She wanted to give back what had been given to her by a stranger she never met. Denise held the letter and smiled. She set it on her desk beside the framed photograph of Ruth, reading glasses on a chain, silver-streaked hair, the faintest smile, as though she'd known all along how this would end. The cycle was continuing, and it was just getting started. That same evening, after dark, Denise let herself into the foundation headquarters on Prescott Street. The bungalow was quiet. The staff had gone home. The hallway lights were off, but the framed ledger pages caught the glow from the street lamp outside, Ruth's careful handwriting visible even in the dim, watching over the rooms like a kind of prayer. The cedar chest sat in the corner of what had once been Ruth's living room. It had been there since Denise moved it from the studio apartment months ago, and it had become part of the room, something people walked past without thinking about, the way you stop noticing a piece of furniture that's always been there. Denise knelt in front of it. She turned the brass key in the lock and lifted the lid. The chest was empty. Every receipt had been pulled. Every check stub had been filed. Every entry in the ledger had been traced to a face, a name, a life her mother had changed from the other side of an anonymous check. The cedar smelled the way it always had, warm and clean, like something that had been kept safe for a long time. Denise ran her hand along the inside of the chest, pressing her fingers into the corners the way you do when you're saying goodbye to something. And in the far corner, taped flat against the bottom, where it had been hidden all along, her fingers caught on a small envelope. She peeled it free. Her hands trembled. The envelope was unsealed, and inside were two things, a photograph and a note. The photograph was a second copy of Ruth and Harold's wedding picture, 1979. Ruth in a simple white dress with daisies in her hair, Harold in a brown suit, grinning like a man who couldn't believe his luck. Two ordinary people on an ordinary day, with no idea that the life they were starting would ripple forward across decades and touch hundreds of lives they would never meet. The note was in Ruth's handwriting, shaky, uneven, written by a hand weakened by the cancer that was already taking her. 4 lines. Denise, if you're reading this, you finished. I knew you would. Your daddy would be so proud. Now live, baby. Go live. Denise pressed the photograph to her chest. She closed her eyes. The tears came, not from grief, not anymore, from completion, from the overwhelming, bone-deep knowledge that she was sitting in the room where her mother had clipped coupons and pretended to be ordinary, and the walls around her were lined with the proof of an extraordinary life. I found them all, Mama, she whispered. Every single one. She stayed there for a long time, kneeling on the floor with the photograph against her heart, letting the silence hold her the way her mother used to. Then she placed the photo and the note gently back in the chest, closed the lid, turned the brass key, and set the key on top. She stood. She walked through the hallway, past Ruth's framed ledger pages, past Gloria's desk and the jar of peppermints, past the plaque with her mother's name, to the front door. She stepped onto the porch of Prescott Street. The evening was warm, the same cracked sidewalk, the same oak trees, the same Memphis sky she'd looked at her whole life, everything the same, everything different. Denise Carter locked the door, walked to her car, and drove into a night that was wide open with possibility. And if this story moved you, if you felt something listening to it, then think about the people in your life whose worth the world hasn't seen yet. The ones who give quietly, the ones who show up without being asked, the ones who carry more than anyone knows. Be the one who sees them. That's the truest inheritance there is.